The room was silent, the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound too loud in your own ears. No crying, no gasping, just 20 pairs of eyes, frozen on a 13-year-old boy standing before the court. A child who, only weeks before, had been laughing in a school gym, scrolling on his phone, thinking about his first crush. Now he was something else entirely. The judge leaned forward, voice sharp enough to cut through the air. You don't deserve to breathe the same air as the rest of humanity. Everyone in that courtroom felt it. The words didn't just land, they echoed. Across the walls. Across the families of two murdered teens. Across a nation suddenly forced to ask a terrifying question. Can a child truly be capable of premeditated murder? Or was this a perfect storm of obsession, rejection, and a brain not yet fully formed? Tonight, we step inside the mind of a teenager. Inside a birthday party that turned into a crime scene. And inside the psychology that divided an entire country. This is not just a true crime story. This is a warning. And once you hear it, you may never see teenage heartbreak the same way again. Before we dive deeper into this disturbing and emotional case, take a second and hit like if you appreciate deep, documentary-style storytelling. If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next true crime breakdown. And if this story gets you thinking, don't forget to share it, because the conversations around mental health and youth violence really matter. All right, let's begin. The music that night was too loud for such a small house, thumping against the walls in a way that made the floor feel alive under everyone's feet. It was the kind of bass that rattled plastic cups, that made bedroom posters tremble slightly, that swallowed conversation and replaced it with laughter, inside jokes, and fragments of teenage dreams whispered between sips of soda. Outside, the sun had given up hours ago, leaving only a quiet suburban street lit by porch lights and the occasional passing headlight. But inside, the world of teenagers operated on a completely different clock. This wasn't just a birthday party. To the kids packed into that home, it was a moment, a break from homework, parents' expectations, and the dull repetition of school days. It was a milestone, even if only for one night. Balloons pressed into the corners of the ceiling, a slightly crooked happy birthday banner hung over a living room doorway, and a table lined with half-eaten pizza stood as evidence of an evening meant to be simple, joyful, and forgettable in the best way. No one thought this night would last forever, but in a more unsettling sense it would. Somewhere among the music and the chatter was a boy trying hard to look normal. He laughed when everyone else laughed. He nodded along when friends spoke. He kept his phone face down on the table, then flipped it over again, then face down once more. To anyone watching casually, he was just another teenager caught up in the buzz of the room. But inside, there was a pressure building, a mix of adrenaline, confusion, jealousy, longing, and something darker he didn't yet have the language to understand. His world didn't feel as light and effortless as the others. He wasn't just there to celebrate a birthday. He was there for a person who, without realizing it, had begun shaping his thoughts, his mood, and the private universe inside his mind. He didn't look at her the way others did. While friends saw a classmate, a crush, or simply a girl at a party, he saw meaning. He saw purpose. He saw his future in the tilt of her smile and the sound of her laughter. And in a tragic twist of perception that would later horrify an entire nation, his brain convinced him that this night, this moment, belonged to him. Teenage years are weird that way. Hormones blur reality. Emotions feel eternal even when they're temporary. Small moments take on massive meaning. A single glance becomes a memory. A simple hug turns into a promise. And rejection? Rejection can feel like the end of the world. Most kids grow out of that intensity, taught slowly by time that feelings shift and people change, that what hurts today won't matter tomorrow. But some minds don't process that lesson in the same way. Some minds spiral inward, replaying moments over and over like a broken record, attaching enormous emotional weight to something that was never meant to hold it. That's where obsession is born, not in dramatic villainy, but in quiet misunderstanding, in the spaces where emotional intelligence hasn't yet caught up with raw feeling. Around 9 in the evening, the party reached that familiar stage where chaos and comfort blurred together. Some teenagers crowded around a video game in the living room, shouting at the screen. Others were in the kitchen, trying to sneak extra slices of cake before it was officially served. A few sat on the floor in a back room, scrolling through messages, laughing at memes, complaining about teachers. The birthday girl moved through it all, caught up in congratulations, hugs, and teasing from her closest friends. She had no idea that the energy in one corner of the room was different. No clue that someone stood slightly apart from the fun, watching moments rather than fully living in them. And if you had paused time and looked closer, you might have noticed how often his eyes found her in a crowd, how he became still when she was near, how the rest of the room might as well have vanished when she laughed at something someone else said. In his mind, that laugh was something sacred. It meant trust, connection, belonging. To him, it wasn't random. It felt chosen. This is one of the most unsettling parts of what would later come to light. The way something beautiful and innocent, a birthday celebration, a safe space among friends, could be interpreted so differently through another person's eyes. For the majority of people in that house, this night was just another memory being made. A harmless one. But for one teenager, it was becoming something else entirely. A line drawn in his mind. A before and after. A story that would later be told again and again, not with laughter, but with disbelief and grief. At some point, the music softened. Phones lit up faces in the dark. Someone opened a window, letting in cool night air that carried the faint scent of grass and summer. The world outside remained quiet, unbothered by the drama unfolding within. Neighbors slept. Streetlights hummed. Life continued on its normal path, completely unaware that one ordinary house held the seeds of something extraordinary in the worst way imaginable. The boy drifted between rooms like a ghost among the living, close enough to be seen, far enough to feel invisible. When the birthday girl hugged him in a casual, friendly way, the kind that lasts a second, the kind that means nothing more than politeness, something inside him locked onto that moment as if it were a vow. The truth is, she had hugged almost everyone that night. It was her party, but his mind edited reality. It zoomed in, erased the rest, amplified only what he wanted to see. Her arms around him weren't a friendly gesture in his head. They were confirmation. They were destiny. That's the terrifying power of perception. Two people can experience the same moment and walk away with completely different memories. One forgets it entirely. The other builds a world around it. As laughter echoed down the hallway, and someone turned the music up again, the boy slipped outside for air. The coolness hit his skin, a sharp contrast to the heat of the crowded house. The night sky stretched endlessly above him, scattered with stars that felt very far away. He stared up as if waiting for guidance, for answers, for someone to explain the storm of feelings inside him. But the sky remained silent. And silence sometimes amplifies the darkest thoughts. Inside the house, the party continued. Friends who trusted each other. Teens who believed they were safe. Parents who assumed their kids were exactly where they should be. A world operating on comfort and routine. But the truth, unseen, unheard, unfelt, was that something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just subtly enough to go unnoticed. A mind had crossed a private line. And once crossed, there is no simple way back. As the minutes ticked forward, normalcy held up its fragile mask. Someone suggested a group photo. Poses were struck. Peace signs. Duck faces. Arms thrown around shoulders. The kind of picture that would later become painful evidence. Smiling faces. Living faces. Proof that joy had existed only moments before it would be stolen away. The camera clicked. The flash flickered. And in that blink of light, no one could have imagined that they were freezing time just before it shattered. This chapter isn't about the crime itself. Not yet. It's about the environment, the normalcy, the safety that gave no warning. It's about understanding something chilling. Monsters don't always appear as monsters. Sometimes they look like kids holding soda cans. Sometimes they laugh at the same jokes as you. Sometimes they stand in the corner of a birthday party, feeling everything too deeply, too intensely, in a way that science still struggles to fully explain. Because here's the uncomfortable question that lingers in the air like smoke. At what exact moment does a human thought turn from fantasy into intent? Was it in the living room, under the flickering lights? Was it outside, under the silent stars? Or had it happened long before any guest even arrived? By the time the party faded into a late-night hush and the first signs of exhaustion crept over the house, something irreversible had already begun. A choice had been quietly forming. Not shouted, not shared, just sealed inside a mind that felt unheard, misunderstood, and desperate to control a world that had never made sense to him in the first place. And that's what makes this case so haunting. Because the scariest part isn't the violence that followed. It's the fact that it started in a room filled with cake, laughter, and teenagers who thought they were safe. It started weeks before the party, in a school hallway lined with lockers that had been slammed shut 1,000 times by bored, restless hands. The kind of hallway where names were carved into desks and secrets were whispered between bells. The kind of place that usually marked nothing more than routine. But on one particular afternoon, it became a turning point. The kind that doesn't announce itself as important until it's seen through the cruel clarity of hindsight. There was a dance coming up, the usual event that meant more in teenage minds than it ever would in the adult world. And conversations had begun floating through friend groups like signals in the air, questions wrapped in nervous laughter. Who are you going with? Are you going to ask her? What if she says no? To most, it was harmless, part of growing up, part of the awkward choreography of adolescence. But to him, this wasn't just a dance. It was a chance to turn imagination into reality, to validate the story he had quietly written in his mind. He had been watching her for a while by then, not in the dramatic way movies sometimes exaggerate, but in the quiet way that goes mostly unnoticed. A glance across a classroom, a slightly too long pause when she spoke, a strange sense of calm mixed with panic when she walked past. She had no idea of the role she was slowly being given in his inner world. While she thought of him as a friendly classmate, someone she had known since elementary school, he had begun to place her at the center of fantasies that felt overwhelmingly real to him. He imagined what it would feel like to hold her hand, how her name would look beside his in a textbook, what it would be like to sit next to her in a movie theater, their shoulders brushing in the dark. These thoughts weren't violent, not yet. They were romantic, soft, glowing with the unrealistic light of young affection. But they were also intense, unbalanced, and built on a foundation of assumption rather than mutual feeling. When he finally asked her to go to the school dance with him, his heart hammered so loudly he thought everyone in the hallway could hear it. She looked surprised, but not uncomfortable. She smiled in that polite, gentle way she had, the kind of smile that tried not to hurt anyone's feelings, and after a moment, she agreed. Just like that. A simple yes. No long speech. No dramatic embrace. Nothing that should have meant more than a normal teenage moment. But to him, it was more than a yes. It was confirmation. It was a victory. It was his world lining up the way he always believed it would. He walked away that day floating, his thoughts racing ahead into a future he assumed had just been unlocked, a future that only existed in his mind, yet felt as solid as the ground beneath his feet. The night of the dance arrived, wrapped in strings of cheap lights and awkward playlists chosen by teachers who no longer understood what students actually liked. The gym was decorated with streamers, the floor sticky with soda spills, the air warm with sweat, perfume, cologne, and nervous energy. Couples gathered in small clusters. Friends circled edges of the room, pretending not to care. When he saw her across the dance floor, dressed up in a way that made her seem both familiar and distant at the same time, something inside him shifted again. She looked unreal, like the version he had created in his mind had stepped out into the world. And for that moment, he felt like the luckiest boy alive. They danced awkwardly at first, barely touching, just swaying to music that was much too grown up for them to understand fully. Then, as the lights dimmed a little and the music softened, they found themselves standing closer, the noise of the room fading in the background. Someone somewhere started a slow song. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then, for a brief, fleeting moment, something happened that he would replay in his mind for months afterward. Their lips touched. It was a simple, clumsy, teenage kiss. The kind that might last only a second or two and mean nothing more than curiosity, a new experience, a soft memory that fades with time. For her, it was exactly that. A first kiss at a school dance, something to laugh about later, a sweet, an awkward milestone on the road to growing up. But for him, that kiss landed with the weight of a lifelong vow. In his mind, there was no such thing as a simple moment. That one touch of lips didn't just happen, it bonded him. It stitched her into his identity. It planted the idea that she was meant to be his, that something official had begun, something that couldn't be undone. And maybe that's the most tragic element of this entire story, the gap between what was real and what was believed. She walked away that night thinking, that was nice, That was awkward. That was over. He walked away thinking, that was the beginning of everything. Psychologists often talk about the adolescent brain as unfinished, still under construction, especially in the areas responsible for regulating emotion, controlling impulses, and understanding long-term consequences. When feelings hit a young mind, they don't arrive in gentle waves. They crash in like storms. And he didn't have the emotional tools to separate fantasy from reality, intensity from truth, affection from attachment. That kiss became his emotional foundation. Every thought afterward seemed to revolve around it. He replayed it again and again, in the shower, in bed, during class, drowning out lessons and conversations, replacing them with his own private movie where they were together, where she smiled only at him, where the rest of the world disappeared. But reality does not obey fantasy. Days passed, then weeks. She went back to her normal routine, talked to her friends, laughed with other classmates, flirted with another boy. To her, the kiss had not defined her world. To him, it had defined his entire future. And slowly, as he noticed the space growing between what he believed and what was happening, discomfort began turning into confusion, then confusion into resentment, then resentment into a quiet but dangerous inner narrative. Why is she acting like it meant nothing? Why is she talking to him like that? Why doesn't she see what we had? This is where the emotional line blurred into something darker. The inside of his mind no longer felt warm and romantic. It started to feel crowded, noisy, possessive. His thoughts circled her constantly. And when those thoughts weren't filled with affection, they were filled with anger. Not the loud, obvious kind, but the slow-burning, invisible type that sits behind your eyes and poisons everything around it. He checked his phone constantly, hoping for a message that never came, then watching her social media activity, looking for meaning in every like, every comment, every photo that didn't include him. The world began to feel unfair to him. He told himself stories to make it make sense. Maybe she was confused. Maybe her friends were influencing her. Maybe she was testing him. Maybe she wanted him to try harder. Every rational explanation faded and was replaced by the one that hurt the most but also fueled him the strongest. She owes me something. But here is the truth that no one had yet said out loud. She owed him nothing. Not her time. Not her attention. Not her affection. Not her love. The kiss had not been a contract. The dance had not been a promise. And yet, in his heart, it might as well have been written in stone. And that's where this story turns from awkward teenage emotion into psychological danger. Because when someone builds their reality on something that never existed in the first place, every moment moving forward becomes a distortion, a misinterpretation, a slow descent into a narrative that only one mind believes in. But that mind is powerful enough to act on it. He was no longer just a boy with a crush. He was a boy who believed he was losing something that belonged to him. And people will do frightening things when they believe something is being taken away. By the time the birthday party arrived, the same party where everyone else arrived with balloons and gifts and casual excitement, he arrived with something far heavier inside him. He didn't bring just a present or a smile. He brought weeks of unspoken feelings, a broken fantasy, silent jealousy, unanswered questions, and a desperate desire to regain control of a story that had slipped out of his hands. That is the real significance of that kiss. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't destiny. It was the moment his mind locked onto a future that was never real and began quietly resenting the world for not giving it to him. And as the next chapter will reveal, when resentment festers inside a young, underdeveloped mind, it doesn't just fade away. It evolves. It adapts. It plans. At first, it didn't even feel like obsession. That's the scary part. It didn't arrive wearing a warning label or announcing itself as something dangerous. It came softly, disguised as curiosity, as affection, as checking in. It started with simple habits that looked harmless on the outside. Opening a social media app a little more often than usual, typing in her name just to see what she had posted, scrolling through comments to see who she was talking to, pausing on photos longer than he should have. In a world driven by instant validation and endless access to other people's lives, this kind of behavior is almost normalized, even expected. But inside his mind, it wasn't casual. It wasn't light. It was becoming a ritual, a compulsion, a way to feel connected to someone who was slowly drifting farther away in reality while remaining trapped in the center of his private world. Every notification made his heart jump. Every lack of notification made it sink. And the silence between exchanges, that silence became personal. When hours turned into days without a message from her, he didn't assume she was busy. He assumed intention. He read meaning into empty space, creating stories that filled the gaps. She was avoiding him. She was punishing him. She was choosing someone else. Jealousy entered the room quietly, like a shadow stretching across his thoughts. When he saw her laughing with another boy in a photo, it wasn't just a picture to him. It felt like betrayal. A stab of something hot and unfamiliar began to form in his chest, and he didn't know what to call it yet. Not anger, not sadness, but something tangled, a mix of longing, possession, and wounded pride all twisted together. The human brain, especially a teenage one, is not always a rational, organized place. It is messy, emotional, impulsive, and driven far more by feelings than by logic. Science has shown again and again that the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and impulse control, the prefrontal cortex, is still developing in adolescence. That means emotional reactions hit harder, and regulating them is much more difficult. Most teens ride those intense emotions like waves and eventually learn to steady themselves. But in his case, instead of learning balance, he began creating an alternate reality where his emotions were law. Every fantasy he had about her felt just as real as any real-world interaction. And in that private universe, she was still his. She just didn't know it yet. That's where obsession breathes, in the gap between reality and imagination. He started paying attention to details most people would miss. The time she logged online, the kind of photos she liked, the captions she used, the emojis she chose. These details, small and meaningless to everyone else, became clues in a story he was determined to decode. He convinced himself that there were hidden messages meant specifically for him. If she posted a sad song lyric, he assumed it was about him. If she posted a happy selfie, he wondered who had made her smile that way. And slowly, his entire mood began to depend on what she did, or didn't, show to the world. When she was quiet, he felt invisible. When she was active, he felt watched. Not by her, but by an imaginary version of her that only existed in his mind. At some point, the idea of simply watching from a distance stopped being enough. The separation between observer and participant began to bother him. He didn't want to just know what she was thinking. He wanted to guide it, influence it, shape it. And that's when a decision formed, one that would later become one of the most disturbing elements of this case: the creation of a fake account. It started as a simple idea. What if she felt more comfortable opening up to someone she didn't know? What if, through an anonymous voice, he could finally hear her real thoughts? It wasn't framed as deception in his mind. It was framed as connection, as curiosity, as a way to understand her better. And so, with a few taps of his fingers, he built an entirely new persona. New name, new photo, new identity. A digital ghost designed for one purpose: to enter her world in a way he no longer could as himself. When he sent the first message, his hands were shaking, even though no one could see him. It was a casual greeting, nothing weird, nothing intense. Just, "Hey, you seem cool. How's your day going?" And when she replied, polite, friendly, open, something inside him surged. It worked. The door had opened. He was inside again. Except this time, he controlled the key. The conversations grew longer, more personal. She spoke about school, about friendships, about family, about the same ordinary things teens often talk about when they believe they are safe. And he listened, and he collected. Every message was stored in his mind, examined for emotional weight, interpreted through a lens that was already warped. He learned what made her laugh, what made her upset, what made her feel insecure. And instead of these insights bringing empathy, they brought a dangerous sense of power. He felt closer to her than ever before, even though the version of him she was talking to didn't actually exist. The lines between him and the fake identity began to blur. Sometimes he wasn't even sure which version of himself she was talking to. And the scariest part was, she trusted the fake one more. That trust fed something unhealthy inside him. He didn't feel guilt the way you might expect. He felt importance, significance, control. When she confided in this digital stranger, he felt chosen again, almost like a twisted version of the kiss, repeated through a screen. He became the only one who truly understood her, at least in his own perception. Everyone else, including her real friends, now felt like outsiders to a world that he alone had access to. But obsession, by its nature, is never satisfied. It always wants more. More attention, more control, more certainty. And certainty was something he did not have. Because as much as he inserted himself into her digital life, the real world still existed. She still walked the school halls without him. She still laughed with other people. She still lived a full life beyond his reach. And that hurt. That hurt turned into anger. And that anger began looking for a solution. He began imagining scenarios where he wouldn't have to share her attention with anyone else. Scenarios where there would be no competition, no uncertainty, no rejection, just permanence, just control. And when such thoughts enter a mind that is young, emotional, and unprepared to handle them, they don't always stay as thoughts. They start feeling like plans, like routes, like options. This wasn't the kind of obsession you see in movies, dramatic, flashy, obvious. No, this was quiet, internal, growing in the dark, watered by silence, jealousy, and a twisted idea of love. To the outside world, he was still just a regular boy going to school, doing homework, showing up at family dinners. Nothing in his face screamed danger. That's what made it so invisible. What made it so terrifying? Because while the world looked at him and saw an ordinary teenager, inside his mind, a private storm was gathering strength. Every interaction through the fake account, every ignored message, every laugh she shared with someone else, added pressure, added weight, added urgency. And something about pressure is important to understand. It doesn't disappear on its own. It either finds relief, or it explodes. By the time the night of the birthday party came around, this wasn't just about feelings anymore. It wasn't about a crush. It wasn't even about romance. It was about something far more unsettling. The need to preserve a fantasy at all costs, and the growing realization that reality was standing in the way. A normal mind would have let go. A healthy mind would have moved on. But this was no longer a healthy state of mind. Inside him, the obsession had matured, hardened, darkened, and the quiet thought that began whispering, barely loud enough to hear, was this: if the world won't give her back to me, then I will take control of the world myself. And that thought, that single moment of internal permission, would soon move from imagination into devastating reality. In today's world, the mind doesn't just leave memories behind, it leaves data, invisible trails that quietly record our thoughts, our movements, our choices, our curiosities. Every message sent, every post liked, every profile visited, every search typed into a glowing screen becomes a breadcrumb dropped along a path we don't even realize we are walking. And for him, that path had been forming for weeks, growing denser, darker, heavier with meaning as his emotions spiraled further out of control. He may have believed he was invisible behind a screen, just another anonymous presence floating through the digital crowd. But the truth is much colder, much more unforgiving. Technology remembers, even when people don't. And when investigators finally stepped into his digital world, they weren't just reading messages. They were stepping directly into the architecture of his mind, walking through the emotional blueprint he had been building in silence. It started with patterns. That's always where the truth begins. Not with one message, not with one account, not with one image, but with repetition that forms a shape, a rhythm that reveals intent. Investigators would eventually look at the timestamps on his phone like pages in a diary that he never knew he was writing. Moments he thought were private, when he logged on late at night, when he checked her profile over and over again in the early morning hours, when he switched between his real identity and the fake one he had created. These moments were frozen in lines of data, each one marking a quiet obsession deepening in real time. It was as if his device had been listening to his heartbeat, tracking the moments when it raced, when it lingered, when it refused to look away. And within those messages, there was a slow evolution that no one around him noticed while it was happening. At first, the tone was friendly, casual, carefully crafted to seem harmless. Simple questions, polite responses, the digital equivalent of a gentle smile across a classroom. But with time, the words grew more personal, more emotionally loaded, more layered with meaning that only he fully understood. He asked about feelings, about fears, about what made her sad. He positioned this fictional version of himself as someone safe, someone who understood without judging, someone who wouldn't disappear. And to her, it was just another friendly presence in the ocean of online communication. But to him, it was much more than that. It was control disguised as care, manipulation wrapped in empathy, a puppet made of words and keystrokes. Behind that screen, he was no longer the quiet, overlooked boy standing in the corner of a room. He was someone with influence, someone with access to her emotions, someone who could ask questions without consequence, without the awkwardness of confronting someone face to face. That separation, that digital mask, freed him in ways that scared even parts of himself. He could say things he would never say out loud. He could test boundaries without ever showing his face. And every reply that came back from her fed the illusion that they were connected on a level deeper than reality allowed. But as with all fake realities, cracks eventually begin to show. His messages grew more intense. The questions became more probing. He wanted reassurances, validation, emotional truth that belonged to a world that didn't exist. When she mentioned other people, other friends, other plans, it twisted inside him. The screen no longer felt like a safe barrier. It felt like a thin wall separating him from something he felt entitled to. And entitlement is one of the most dangerous emotions a human being can experience. The belief that something is owed, that something must be returned, that the world has an obligation to fulfill the story you have written for yourself. That entitlement began to leak into his behavior outside of the digital world too. He started paying closer attention to every movement in real life. Noticing where she sat, noticing who walked her to class, noticing the subtle ways she seemed happier when she wasn't talking to him. To an outsider, it would have looked like simple curiosity. A kid looking around. A glance here, a pause there. But under the surface, his mind was constantly calculating, comparing, analyzing. Who is she closest to? Who makes her laugh the most? Who stands too close? Who is a threat to the fantasy I have created? These thoughts circled endlessly, like a predator tracking unseen prey. Except in this case, the prey didn't even know the hunt had begun. When investigators later reconstructed his digital activity, they didn't just see obsession, they saw escalation. The search history alone painted a picture of a mind searching for answers it didn't fully understand. Questions about rejection, about betrayal, about loyalty. Mixed among innocent searches were darker, heavier lines of curiosity, the kind you'd expect from someone teetering on the edge of an emotional cliff. Not because they had already decided to jump, but because the thought had begun to exist. And that's the part most people struggle to comprehend. Harm often begins as a thought long before it ever becomes an action. There was no sudden switch, no dramatic, now I will do something terrible moment. It was more like a slow lowering of moral barriers, one rationalization at a time. He told himself she deserved to understand how he felt. Then he told himself she had misled him. Then he told himself she had taken something from him. And when a person starts believing they've been wronged by someone who never meant to hurt them, the mind looks for a way to restore balance. Not emotionally, not mentally, but through control. Digital footprints are cruel that way. They don't care about excuses. They don't care about misunderstanding. They present only facts. Here is where you were. Here is what you typed. Here is what you searched. Here is what you tried to hide. When those pieces are arranged correctly, they form a silent confession long before any words are spoken out loud. Yet, the most chilling thing was not the messages themselves. It was the timing. How the digital intensity peaked in the days leading up to the party. The frequent logins late into the night. The restless switching between accounts. The sudden pauses, followed by bursts of activity. Like a heart racing, then stopping, then racing again. A rhythm that mirrored a mind struggling with a decision that had not yet been fully spoken, even to itself. While balloons were being purchased, cake was being ordered, and decorations were being hung up by people who believed only in celebration and normalcy, he was quietly sinking deeper into a state of emotional isolation. To him, the world was not preparing for a birthday party. It was preparing for an ending, the kind of ending that only made sense to him. In the real world, that house was still just a house. That party was still just a party. Those friends were still just kids wanting to laugh, eat, and forget about homework for a few hours. In his inner world, however, everything had already taken on a heavier meaning. The gathering wasn't just a celebration. It had become a stage in his mind, a place where something needed to be confronted, reclaimed, resolved. And that is what makes the digital evidence so haunting. Not because it simply records behavior, but because it whispers intention. It reveals the slow mental journey from hurt feelings to distorted thinking, from distorted thinking to dangerous obsession, from obsession to a need for control that reality itself could no longer contain. The scariest part is this. If you had walked past him in the hallway that week, you would have seen nothing unusual. Just another kid with a phone in his hand, another student in a crowded school. You would not have seen the storm unfolding behind his eyes. You would not have seen the digital web he had spun around one person. You would not have seen the psychological walls closing in around his own mind. But his phone recorded it all. And when the world finally looked back at those records, it wasn't just reading messages. It was reading the slow, tragic, preventable rise of a mind losing its grip on reality. And the truth is, by the time that birthday cake was placed on the table, by the time the lights dimmed and the music filled the room, by the time smiling faces gathered for photos, it was already too late to simply undo what had been happening in silence. Because an obsession that deep, that intimate, that carefully built in the shadows of a digital world does not disappear on its own. It demands a conclusion. And that conclusion was now moving closer, minute by minute, message by message, heartbeat by heartbeat, toward the night everything broke. There is a strange cruelty to the way ordinary moments can disguise the most irreversible turning points in human life. And that night did nothing to warn anyone of how deeply it would scar the memory of everyone who passed through it. Because on the surface it still looked like what it was always meant to be. A simple birthday gathering wrapped in cheap decorations, familiar faces, pizza boxes, and the loose, careless energy of teenagers who believed tomorrow was theirs by default. The music pulsed through the walls with the rhythm of youth. Laughter bounced off ceilings and door frames, and the entire room swayed with the messy, beautiful chaos of people living only in the present moment, unaware that they were standing on the edge of something that would later be called tragedy. Shoes were kicked off and left in corners. Phones were forgotten on couches, and the world beyond the windows remained silent, still, and uninterested, as if it too refused to acknowledge what was beginning to unfold inside that house. To everyone else, it was just another night that might be remembered for jokes, photos, awkward dancing, or maybe not remembered at all. But inside one conflicted, overwhelmed mind, this evening had already taken on the unbearable weight of an ending that he did not know how to escape. He moved through the house like someone walking inside a memory that wasn't fully his, aware of every sound, every shifting shadow, every imagined glance, but entirely disconnected from the normal rhythms of the party. The laughter around him no longer sounded joyful. It sounded distant, almost mocking, as if happiness itself had turned into something personal and cruel. His eyes kept searching for her in the shifting crowd, and every time he found her, it was like pressing on a bruise that throbbed with emotional pain he did not understand how to name. She existed in the room as both everything he wanted and everything he could not have, and that contradiction pressed in on his mind until it felt like the walls were closing around his thoughts. The week before had already blurred the line between imagination and reality in his head, but in this moment, surrounded by living proof that the world was not following the story he had written, the gap between those two worlds became a space of unbearable tension. Her laughter with other people, the easy way she spoke to friends, the unchanged normalcy of her behavior confirmed the one thing he could not accept, that she had moved on from something he had never truly been part of in the first place. That realization did not pass through him gently. It did not come as a calm understanding or a mature acceptance. It arrived like a wave of humiliation, confusion, and helplessness that overwhelmed every rational part of his thinking. The version of reality he had nursed for so long, the one where that kiss meant permanence, where her kindness meant commitment, where her existence somehow revolved around him, began to collapse in real time, and his mind, still young and unable to regulate its own storms, reached for the only thing it believed could stabilize the chaos: control. He did not feel like a boy at a party anymore. He felt small, erased, insignificant, and in that emotional state, the idea of being irrelevant was more terrifying than anything else. It wasn't simply about her. It was about the crushing fear of being unseen, unchosen, unimportant in a world that moved on without him. While everyone else remained wrapped in conversations and sugar-filled laughter, a decision, though not spoken, though not screamed, settled into the deepest part of his consciousness, as quiet and heavy as stones sinking into water. It wasn't formed as a grand plan or a dramatic declaration. It came as a simple, devastating internal shift. The belief that this moment had to change, no matter the cost, because the pain of letting it continue as it was felt larger than any consequence he could imagine. And when a human mind reaches that state, consequences disappear. Future disappears. Morality blurs. All that is left is the urgent need to stop the unbearable emotional noise inside. Outside, nothing changed. A breeze brushed against the darkened windows, indifferent to the unraveling reality within. Somewhere far down the street, a car passed, headlights sweeping across quiet lawns and sleeping houses, a normal scene untouched by the invisible tension inside this one particular home. Upstairs and downstairs, friends still existed in a version of the world that made sense, unaware that something unrecognizable was beginning to overshadow the night. This separation between internal chaos and external normalcy is what makes situations like this so difficult for the world to comprehend later. From the outside, there was no clear warning, no violent outburst, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, tragic shift happening entirely within a single mind. As time passed, the music grew quieter, the conversations more scattered, the party naturally beginning to wind down. To the others, it was just the normal fading of a long evening. To him, it felt like the final countdown of something irreversible. Every second that passed deepened the sense that he was losing something. Losing control, losing relevance, losing the imagined future that had once seemed so real. There was no protecting himself from that feeling anymore. It sat in his chest like a weight, crushing the part of him that once knew how to dream without attachment, how to exist without obsession. And then came the first ripple of realization among the group. Not panic, not immediate understanding, just a strange pause, a subtle shift in the energy of the house. Laughter hesitated in the air. A voice somewhere asked a question that didn't receive an answer. Someone looked around, confused, unsure why the room suddenly felt different. It was in that fragile moment, when the world still hadn't fully broken, when the truth hadn't yet taken shape, that innocence quietly slipped away for the last time. What followed would never be seen as simply a misunderstanding or a bad moment. It would become a defining scar, etched permanently into memory. The beauty of the decorations suddenly felt tragic. The half-deflated balloons in the corner, the leaned picture frames, the smudged banner, the untouched slices of cake. These small, harmless objects became silent witnesses, frozen tokens of a happiness that had allowed itself to exist only minutes before being swallowed by something far darker. People who had been smiling only moments ago now moved with uncertainty. Voices dropped lower. Movements grew cautious. A realization was beginning to spread that whatever had just happened, whatever line had been crossed, could not be undone. And yet, even in this moment, the full weight of it had not arrived. That realization would come later, in police lights, in interviews, in courtrooms, in newspaper headlines, in hushed family conversations, in years of unanswered questions. But right here, in this fragile, suspended moment in time, it was still only a feeling. An undeniable sense that the world had shifted off its axis and that the night would be remembered for reasons no one could yet process. The music was no longer the loudest presence in the house. Silence had taken its place, thick, heavy, and filled with meaning. And in that silence lay the end of childhood for everyone who stood inside those walls. That is how the night everything broke truly happened. Not with cinematic explosions, not with dramatic warning signs, but with a quiet realization that something precious had just disappeared forever. And the worst part was this: it had all begun at a birthday party. The room where he was taken did not look like the kind of place where life-changing truths should be spoken. It was ordinary, almost forgettable. Muted walls, a simple table, a few chairs, a clock ticking with indifferent consistency. Places like this exist everywhere. In police stations and government buildings and institutions most people will never need to know well, spaces designed not for drama, but for procedure. Yet history has a strange way of selecting the most mundane locations to carry the heaviest emotional weight. And in that small, quiet room, the air was thick with something words could hardly describe. Hours earlier, he had been just another teenager at a birthday party. Now he sat on one side of that table, small in frame, young in face, eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion, detachment, and something far more confusing, a kind of chilling stillness, as though his mind had stepped away from reality to protect itself from what had just occurred. Across the table were adults who had spent years being trained to read what couldn't be spoken out loud. They weren't there just to hear words. They were there to read pauses, breathing patterns, deflections, expressions that flickered across a face too young to be carrying such enormous consequences. To them, the question was not just what had happened, but who was sitting in front of them. Were they looking at a frightened child caught in the aftermath of something incomprehensible? Or were they sitting across from someone who had made a conscious, deliberate, irreversible choice? That question hung in the air between them, unsaid but all-consuming. He didn't look like a monster. That is what disturbed many people later more than anything else. There were no exaggerated expressions of evil, no wild, untamed fury in his eyes. There was just a boy who seemed lost inside a world that no one else had seen while it was being built. His answers, when they came, were often short, vague, wrapped in confusion or silence. Sometimes he met their gaze. Sometimes he stared down at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to be trying to answer a single impossible question. How can someone be both a child and the center of something so devastating at the same time? The investigators approached him carefully, not with shouting or intimidation, but with measured words designed to open doors instead of slam them shut. They asked about the party, about the people who were there, about how the night had felt to him. Their tone was calm, almost gentle, as though they were walking on the edge of something fragile and dangerous at the same time. But behind that softness was an unshakable reality. No matter how gently they spoke, the truth was still the truth, and the room seemed to lean in closer, waiting for it to reveal itself. In the pauses between questions, something else became visible, not just guilt or innocence, but a fractured inner world struggling to make sense of itself. He did not describe his actions the way an adult might. There were no clear lines of motive or reasoning that fit comfortably into logic. His answers wandered. They circled around feelings rather than facts. He spoke of confusion, of being hurt, of feeling ignored, of emotions too big for words. And in these fragmented explanations lay the disturbing realization that this was not a traditional criminal mind at work. This was the mind of an adolescent, incomplete, flooded with emotion, unable to regulate or clearly articulate the chaos that had been growing for so long inside him. Psychologists watching the case later would debate endlessly. Had he truly understood the finality of what he had done? Did he grasp the weight of death, the permanence of loss, the impact on families, friendships, futures? Or was he functioning within a distorted emotional tunnel, where the only reality that mattered was his own pain? The human brain is still forming critical structures at that age, especially those tied to impulse control, empathy regulation, and long-term thinking. And yet here sat a boy placed in the same room, where grown men confess to crimes that carry lifelong consequences. It was a collision between biology and justice, science and society, childhood and accountability. Outside that room, the world had already begun to react. Adults whispered in hallways. Parents clutched their children closer. Rumors raced through schools, through neighborhoods, through an online space that devours tragedy with frightening speed. Everyone wanted an explanation that made sense, something that fit into a simple narrative, a clear box labeled good or evil. But the deeper the investigators went, the more complicated it became. Every digital record, every message, every witness account, every psychological insight painted a picture that was not clean or easily defined. It was tangled, layered, deeply human, and deeply disturbing. One of the most difficult parts for those involved was the simple fact that he was still legally and visibly a child. His hands were small, his voice not fully settled into adulthood, his posture slouched in a way that seemed more appropriate for a classroom than an interrogation room. And yet the consequences of what had happened had erupted into the adult world of law, punishment, and permanent judgment. The law does not deal in emotional ambiguity easily. It seeks clarity. It seeks responsibility. It seeks lines that can be drawn. But psychology, especially adolescent psychology, rarely offers such clean boundaries. Silence filled the room more often than words. Long pauses where nothing was said, but everything was felt. The kind of silence that presses against the ears until it becomes louder than conversation. In those moments, You could almost feel the weight of every question ever asked about human nature hovering in the air. Are we born good? Does environment shape us? How much of our behavior is chosen and how much is wired? Where does a broken mind end and personal responsibility begin? And within that silence, his face remained young, untouched by the lines of age, yet permanently altered by a night that could never be undone. The interrogation did not have the drama of movies. There were no over-the-table accusations, no sudden confessions blurted out in desperation. Instead, it unfolded like a slow, painful autopsy of a state of mind. Every detail that emerged only deepened the tragedy. Every realization only made the situation more unbearable. And the most haunting part was the understanding that no answer, no explanation, no confession could ever restore what had been taken or erase what had happened. By the time the session came to an end, one thing was certain: the world would never see him the same way again. He would not be remembered as a kid at a party. He would not be remembered for his favorite songs, his school memories, or his quiet presence in a classroom. He would be defined forever by the worst night of his life and the lives that were shattered in its wake. And as he was led away, the question that would echo through courtrooms, headlines, and public opinion had already taken root in the minds of those who had seen him that night. Was he a lost child trapped inside a storm he did not know how to survive? Or was he something far darker, far more terrifying than anyone wanted to accept? That question would become the center of everything that followed, and the world was about to watch it unfold. The courtroom did not roar when the case began. It breathed, slowly, cautiously, like a space that understood it had been assigned the task of carrying something far too heavy for ordinary walls. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of families, reporters, legal observers, and strangers who had come not only to witness justice, but to witness a question that had already split the public in two. At one table sat a boy in a suit that did not quite hide the fact that he should have been in a classroom, his hands folded, his posture unnaturally still, as if movement itself had become dangerous. At the other side sat the unwavering presence of the state, firm, calculated, prepared to argue that age does not erase responsibility. Somewhere in between sat a judge, the quiet embodiment of a system now forced to decide something that legal textbooks could never fully prepare anyone for. How do you measure the weight of a child's mind against the gravity of an irreversible act? From the first day, it was clear that this was not going to be a typical legal battle. This was not just prosecution and defense arguing over timelines and technicalities. This was science versus certainty, empathy versus consequence, development versus destruction. Experts in adolescent psychology filled the room with words that tried desperately to translate what no simple sentence could ever contain. They spoke about the prefrontal cortex, about impulse control, about how the teenage brain is not yet finished forming the very structures that govern long-term reasoning, emotional regulation, and full comprehension of consequences. They explained how adolescents feel emotions more intensely than adults, how rejection activates the same neurological pathways as physical pain, how obsession can masquerade as attachment in a mind still building its sense of identity. They painted a portrait not of a stereotype, but of a biological and psychological reality, a mind still under construction, still fragile, still dangerously unfinished. And yet, on the other side of the room, another truth stood tall and impossible to ignore. 2 lives had been lost, 2 futures erased, 2 families ripped open in ways words could never repair. The prosecution did not speak in the language of brain scans and developmental phases. They spoke in the language of accountability, of consequences, of the message society sends when it hesitates to draw a line between right and wrong. They reminded the courtroom that harm does not become less devastating simply because of the age of the person who caused it. They spoke for the silent absence left at family tables, in empty bedrooms, in photographs now frozen in time. They argued that if the law bends too easily in the face of tragedy, it risks telling the world that intent can hide behind immaturity. Each statement from one side seemed to strengthen the argument of the other. When the defense spoke of trauma, the prosecution spoke of terror. When the experts spoke of underdeveloped brain functions, the victim's family spoke of underdeveloped futures. When emotional testimony filled the air, the demands of the law reminded everyone that feelings alone cannot shape justice in a society built on order. The courtroom became less a legal arena and more a philosophical battlefield where some of the most difficult questions about humanity were being fought in real time. Where does responsibility begin? Where does childhood end? At what point does pain turn into choice, and choice into crime? The public watched every moment with a mixture of fascination and horror. News outlets replayed court sketches. Social media erupted into endless debates. Some called for the harshest possible outcome, insisting that evil, no matter the age of its source, must be punished. Others saw only a deeply broken child, arguing that society had failed long before that night ever arrived. The case evolved beyond the individuals involved and into a mirror reflecting every fear, belief, and bias people carry about youth, violence, mental health, and justice. Families across the country held their children closer. Schools revisited their counseling policies. Conversations around dinner tables grew heavier, more uneasy, filled with the uncomfortable awareness that safety is often an illusion, even in the most familiar places. Inside the courtroom, time seemed to stretch. Days turned into weeks. Testimonies overlapped and blurred. Evidence was presented, not in sensationalism, but in quiet, measured detail that made the reality all the more unbearable. The boy at the center of it all hardly changed his expression. He did not perform sorrow in the way people expect. He did not show anger. He appeared distant, absorbing the words of experts discussing him as if he were both present and absent at the same time. In his silence, people saw everything they wanted to see: guilt, emptiness, innocence, monstrousness, confusion. Silence became his loudest statement and the most debated part of his presence. The judge watched it all with a gravity that seemed carved from stone. Every testimony, every emotional outburst, every scientific explanation layered onto a decision that could not be undone once spoken aloud. This was not just about punishment. This was about precedent, about the line future generations would point to and say, "This is where society decided what childhood really meant." The weight of that realization was not lost on anyone in the room. And yet, the law does not pause for philosophy. Eventually, the arguments must end, the evidence must rest, and one voice must decide what history will remember. As the final day approached, the atmosphere grew unbearable in its stillness. Breathing felt louder. Time seemed slower. Families gripped hands. Lawyers gathered their papers knowing none of their carefully constructed phrases could fully carry the weight of what was about to happen. The world leaned in through television screens and newspapers and whispered conversations, waiting for the words that would define the rest of this story. And in the quiet just before the judge returned to the bench, one truth was undeniable. No matter what sentence was handed down, no one would leave that room whole. The law might deliver a verdict, but it could never restore what had been taken, nor could it turn that young mind back into the person it once might have become. The only question that remained was simple and devastating. Would the court see a child, or would it see a criminal? And in just a few moments, the answer would echo far beyond those courtroom walls. There is a kind of silence that exists only in courtrooms when grieving families prepare to speak, a silence that feels heavier than any verdict, because in that moment, words are no longer filtered through lawyers, experts, or legal language. They come directly from hearts that have been split open and left to somehow continue beating. When the first parent stood and walked toward the podium, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted, as if every person present instinctively understood they were about to hear something sacred, something raw, something that could never truly be translated into legal terms. Courtrooms are built for arguments, for evidence, for order, but they are not built to hold the kind of grief that arrives when a parent must speak about a child who will never walk through a door again, will never answer another text, will never celebrate another birthday. Voices trembled, not because of weakness, but because the body doesn't know how to carry a pain that violates the natural order of things. Parents are not supposed to bury their children. That role reversal is one of the deepest wounds a human can endure. And as each family member spoke, the room did not just hear about loss. It felt it in the air, in the way people lowered their eyes, in the way hands tightened together, in the way even the most seasoned professionals struggled to maintain distance. They spoke of small details that now felt unbearably important. The favorite songs, the messy bedrooms, the inside jokes, the way laughter used to fill the house without effort. Ordinary things, transformed by absence into ghosts that lived everywhere at once. Some spoke about anger, about a rage so deep it frightened them, a rage that kept them awake at night and followed them through their days. Others spoke in broken whispers about confusion, about the unending question of why, about the desperate search for logic in something that had shattered their entire understanding of the world. How do you wake up knowing the sun has still risen, the birds have still sung, and yet a piece of your universe has simply vanished, never to be returned? How do you sit at a family table knowing there is a seat that will remain empty for the rest of time? These questions did not come from academic analysis or philosophical debate. They came from a place where love and pain exist together in the most brutal harmony imaginable. And as the family spoke, something else happened that no legal proceeding is truly designed to handle. The courtroom was forced into empathy. It was no longer just a space for judgment. It became a place of collective mourning. Even those who had arrived with strong opinions felt the complexity of the situation deepen. It was impossible to listen to the voices of these families and not feel the magnitude of what had been taken from them. Yet, in that same room, only a few feet away, sat the boy at the center of it all, silent, still, unreachable in his own way. And that proximity created a tension so unbearable it almost felt unreal. The same air that held a mother's tears also held the child who had caused them. The human mind struggles to contain such contradiction. Some of the family members didn't just speak about their loved ones. They spoke to him. Their words were not always calm, not always measured. They were filled with a pain that had nowhere else to go. They asked questions that would never be answered. They voiced the thoughts that haunt people at their lowest points. And yet, beneath the anger and devastation, there was also a strange universality. The simple fact that all of them had once known what it meant to love a child. In a tragic, impossible twist, this was the only thing connecting them: love for someone young, vulnerable, and full of unrealized potential. Outside the courtroom, the world amplified everything. Cameras waited. Headlines were prepared. Opinions multiplied in endless streams of commentary. But inside, in those long, unbearable moments, the world shrank to something deeply human and deeply intimate. A room full of people confronting the most painful reality imaginable. There were no easy villains in that moment. No satisfying narrative. Only brokenness layered on top of brokenness, loss on top of loss. Even the judge, bound by the rigid structure of law, could not entirely separate legal duty from the emotional gravity unfolding in front of them. This was no longer merely a case. It was a living, breathing testament to how fragile life is, how quickly joy can be erased, how one night can carve a permanent scar into an infinite number of futures. The families weren't just asking for justice. They were asking for meaning, for acknowledgement, for some kind of assurance that their children's lives had mattered enough to change something about the world they left behind. And in that desperate hope lay one of the most heartbreaking truths of all. Even the strongest punishment could never bring back what was lost. Even the harshest sentence could never fill the empty chairs, replace the silent phones, or make the world whole again. At best, it could offer a thin sense of closure, a symbolic line drawn in the sand to say this matters, this life mattered, this pain cannot be ignored. As they returned to their seats, eyes red, bodies heavy, the reality of the situation settled over the room like a thick veil. Everyone understood now that whatever was about to happen next would echo for years, perhaps forever. This was not just a courtroom anymore. It was a memorial to futures that never arrived. A reminder of how quickly everything can change. A place where love had collided with unimaginable loss. And as the last voice fell silent, the question that now filled the space was even heavier than before. How could any punishment ever equal this kind of absence? No one had the answer. And the most difficult words of all were still yet to be spoken. When the courtroom reconvened, it felt less like the continuation of a legal process and more like the closing of a chapter no one had been ready to read. The benches filled slowly, every step echoing louder than it should have, every rustle of fabric and paper magnified by the silence that had settled over the room like an unseen fog. No one spoke above a whisper. There was nothing left to debate now, no more evidence to examine, no more expert voices to analyze the mind of the boy sitting quietly at the defense table. All that remained was judgment, the kind that does not exist in theory, but in reality, where words travel beyond walls and shape entire futures. The air was thick with anticipation, with dread, with a strange and terrible curiosity about which side of history the court was about to stand on. The boy did not look toward the families. He did not scan the room. His gaze stayed fixed, either on the table before him or somewhere far beyond it, as if he had already drifted away from the present moment. To a stranger, he would have looked almost ordinary, just another teenager in an uncomfortable suit, sitting through something he did not entirely want to be part of. But everyone in that room knew that nothing about him was ordinary anymore. He had become a symbol, a question mark shaped like a human being, carrying the unbearable weight of a case that had blurred the boundaries between childhood and monstrosity in the public imagination. The judge spoke slowly, deliberately, aware that every word would be recorded, replayed, quoted, dissected, and remembered long after the building had emptied. This was not just a sentence being delivered. It was a message to the world about boundaries, about responsibility, about what society chooses to do when faced with something too painful and too complex to handle gently. The tone did not tremble. It held the rigid certainty of law, even as the subject standing before it was anything but simple. And when those now infamous words were spoken, time in that room seemed to fracture into two realities, before and after. You don't deserve to breathe. Some gasped. Some closed their eyes. Some felt an almost physical sting, as though the air itself had been struck. Those 7 words rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water, touching every person differently. To some, it felt like justice finally choosing to speak in a language as severe as the crime. To others, it felt like a door slamming shut on any remaining trace of mercy, any lingering hope that a child's life could be salvaged from the ruins of a single night. It was not just a statement. It was a line drawn in bloodless but powerful ink, an erasure of childhood, an acknowledgement that whatever innocence had once existed was now legally and morally extinguished. The families reacted not with applause or celebration, but with collapse. Grief does not resolve itself neatly at the sound of a verdict. It does not disappear just because the law has spoken. Some wept quietly. Others held each other in an attempt to stay standing. Justice, when it arrives, rarely looks like relief. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like a dull realization that even the harshest sentence cannot bring back what was lost, cannot rewind time to that night when everything still made sense. And yet, for many of them, the verdict was the only form of acknowledgement this world had left to offer, a symbolic confirmation that what happened to their loved ones would not be minimized, excused, or forgotten. For the boy, the meaning of those words was impossible to measure from the outside. His expression did not collapse into hysteria. He did not cry out. He simply sat there, as still as he had been throughout the trial, absorbing the transformation that had just taken place. In one sentence, he had crossed from human complexity into legal finality. In the eyes of the system now, he was no longer a confused teenager, no longer a fragile mind shaped by obsession and emotional instability. He was something else entirely. A cautionary tale. A permanent resident of the darkest chapter of a community's history. Outside the courthouse, the world ignited into reaction. Cameras flashed relentlessly. News outlets framed the story in bold, unforgiving headlines. Social media split into warring sides. Thousands of voices arguing whether justice had been served or humanity had failed. Some praised the judge's firmness, claiming that accountability must exist regardless of age. Others condemned the sentence as cruel, arguing that a society is judged by how it treats its most broken, not its most perfect. The case became a battleground for moral philosophy, legal reform, mental health awareness, and the ever-evolving debate surrounding juvenile justice. But beyond the noise of public opinion, there was a quieter, deeper reality settling in. A girl would never walk across a graduation stage. A family would never hear their child's voice again. A boy would never have the chance to outgrow the worst version of himself, never experience redemption, never redefine his story. 3 futures had been erased in different ways, and that emptiness would echo long after the cameras moved on and new headlines replaced this one. Communities began holding vigils. Schools held moments of silence. Counselors visited classrooms where students now looked at one another with uneasy awareness. Parents tightened their grip on children's hands. Teachers spoke in softened voices about empathy. about consequences, about the importance of reaching out when emotions feel too big to contain. In its devastation, the case began shaping conversations that extended beyond the individuals involved. It forced people to look inward, to examine the emotional lives of teenagers, to ask how isolation, obsession, and unregulated pain can quietly grow in places where no one thinks to look. And yet, no matter how many conversations it sparked, no matter how many reforms it inspired, the core truth remained unchanged. It was too late. Nothing would bring back that night. Nothing would restore what had been destroyed. The sentence did not fix the world. It only acknowledged that a part of it had been shattered beyond repair. As the doors of the courtroom finally closed behind everyone, the finality of it all settled like a cold weight in the chest. The echo of the judge's words lingered not just in the hallway, but in the collective memory of everyone who had heard them. You don't deserve to breathe. A sentence meant for one boy, but felt by an entire world struggling to understand how something so young could give birth to something so dark. And as history sealed that moment into permanent record, another question rose quietly, persistently, refusing to disappear. Did justice truly win that day? Or did humanity lose something it can never get back? The answer would haunt the years to come. Long after the courtroom emptied, long after the cameras were packed away, long after the world scrolled on to the next headline, the real weight of this story settled into a much quieter place. The minds of those who could not forget it. In the stillness that follows tragedy, when the noise fades and the opinions scatter, what remains is a question that refuses to be easily dismissed. It is the kind of question that sits heavy in the chest on sleepless nights and resurfaces in casual conversations that suddenly lose their comfort. Was he born a monster? Did something inside him break beyond all recognition? Or was he a reflection of something far more uncomfortable, the fragile, chaotic, and sometimes dangerous vulnerability of the human mind when it is left to drown in its own emotional storms? Human beings have always searched for villains because villains make the world easier to understand. They give cruelty a clear shape. They offer the illusion that darkness comes only in recognizable forms. But this case refused to provide that simplicity. The face at the center of it did not belong to an ancient myth or a cinematic antagonist. It belonged to someone who, in another life, might have simply blended into the background of ordinary days, gone unnoticed in classrooms, passed on sidewalks, laughed at jokes that were only half funny. That is what haunted people the most. Not the details of what happened, but the terrifying banality of who he once was. An ordinary boy whose internal world had twisted into something unrecognizable, quietly, invisibly, until one night forced that reality into view. Psychologists continued to examine the case long after the verdict had been sealed, not out of sympathy alone, nor out of condemnation, but out of a desperate need to understand how such transformation takes place. They spoke of emotional immaturity, of rejection sensitivity, of obsessive attachment, of how adolescence is a turbulent neurological landscape where identity is still forming and emotional pain can feel infinite. They explained how some minds, when submerged in isolation and unmet emotional needs, start to construct alternate realities in order to survive. Realities where imagined bonds feel as tangible as real ones. Realities where rejection does not feel like a normal part of human experience, but like a catastrophic erasure of self. And yet, understanding these mechanisms did not erase the harm. Knowledge did not translate into forgiveness. Explanation did not equal justification. Society, too, was left to examine itself. Schools questioned how well they really knew what their students were carrying inside. Parents wondered how many silent storms live behind closed bedroom doors. Social platforms, so often seen as harmless distractions, became suspicious spaces where obsession and delusion could quietly take root. Communities were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that safety is not only about locked doors and security cameras. It is also about emotional literacy, mental health awareness, and the terrifying things that can grow when loneliness is left unchecked. In prison, surrounded by walls too strong to ignore, time moved differently for the boy who had once stood under balloons and birthday lights. Days blurred into each other, stripped of the chaos that had once ruled his inner world. Silence surrounded him in a new, permanent form. There were no messages to check, no faces to search for in a crowd. no imagined futures to cling to. Only the slow realization of what had been done and the endless echo of all the moments that could never be undone. And perhaps that was the most haunting punishment of all, not just confinement, but consciousness, awareness, the irreversible understanding that a single night had rewritten countless lives, including his own. Yet even in that quiet, society's argument did not end. In universities, in talk shows, in online forums, people continued to debate what this case truly represented. Some saw only a criminal who received exactly what he deserved. Others saw a deeply sick mind that had failed to be recognized and treated in time. Still others saw a tragic intersection of nature, nurture, and circumstance, where a perfect storm of emotional instability and unchecked obsession collided with devastating consequences. No consensus ever formed. And perhaps that in itself was the message, that human behavior is rarely confined to one neat label. That monsters, if they exist at all, often look heartbreakingly human. The families, meanwhile, tried to rebuild the impossible. Birthdays still came and went. Holidays still arrived and passed. Seasons still changed. But everything carried an absence so heavy it shaped the air itself. Their loved ones lived on in photographs, in stories, in worn-out clothes, in half-remembered laughter. Grief became a permanent resident in their homes, sleeping beside them, waking up with them, walking with them into every new day. They learned to carry it not because it grew lighter, but because the human heart, somehow, learns how to survive around the weight of impossible things. And so the story did not truly end with a sentence or a closed courtroom door. It lived on in whispered warnings, in changed policies, in conversations between parents and children, in social workers and counselors paying closer attention, in teachers noticing the quiet ones sitting at the back of the room. It became a story people told not for entertainment, but as a reminder of what can happen when emotions turn inward and rot, when reality is replaced by fantasy, when pain is left to echo unanswered. Perhaps the most important question is not whether he was a monster or a misunderstood mind. Perhaps the real question is what the world chooses to learn from his existence. Will it look away once the horror fades, or will it lean in, uncomfortable and alert, listening to the quiet signals before they grow into something irreversible? Will it invest in empathy the same way it invests in security? Will it take teenage emotions seriously, not as drama, but as powerful forces that can shape or destroy lives? There is no simple ending here, no clean resolution, just a lingering awareness that human minds are fragile landscapes, capable of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary darkness. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one obsession, one unspoken pain to change the course of many lives forever. Maybe, in the end, this story is not just about what one person did. Maybe it is about what everyone else failed to see. And maybe that is the most unsettling truth of all.